You touch that bike, boy, you're touching the dead. Ethan Walker heard that warning 11 times before he ever laid a single finger on the machine. And every single time he nodded, looked down at his cracked boots, and walked away. Until the night his sister stopped breathing. That was the night everything changed. That was the night a 19-year-old kid with bleeding hands and empty stomach and absolutely nothing left to lose decided that dead men couldn't stop him, and unknowingly set in motion something that would shake an entire nation of outlaws to their core. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button right now, turn on notifications so you never miss a single chapter, and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go. The morning Ethan Walker turned 19, nobody remembered. Not his boss, not his neighbors, not the three guys he worked beside every single day at Grayson's scrapyard, shoveling rust and breathing metal dust from 6 in the morning until the light died. His sister Maya remembered she was 12 years old, and she drew him a birthday card on the back of an old grocery receipt with a broken crayon. But she was running a fever that morning, same as the 3 mornings before it, and by the time Ethan got home from his shift, she was already asleep on the couch with her coat pulled over her shoulders because the trailer's heating unit had stopped working sometime in the night. He stood over her for a long time. He counted the money in his pocket, $43 and some change. He sat down at the kitchen table, which wasn't really a kitchen table, just an old cable spool someone had dragged in from the yard, and he put his head in his hands and he stayed there until the dark outside turned into the gray kind of dark that comes just before dawn. Black Hollow, Montana didn't have a lot going for it. It had one gas station, one bar, one church that hadn't held a service in 4 years, and a population of roughly 900 people who mostly stayed because they didn't have anywhere better to go. The coal mine that had built the town had closed before Ethan was born. The refinery that replaced it had killed his father when Ethan was 14, a pressure valve explosion that the company paid out in a settlement so small it barely covered the funeral. After that, it was just Ethan and Maya in a trailer on the edge of the scrapyard property that their father had rented month to month, and that Wade Grayson, the man who now owned the yard, allowed them to continue occupying in exchange for Ethan working off the back rent. That was the deal. It was never written down. It was never discussed in any detail. It was simply the way things were, and Ethan had learned young that questioning the way things were in Black Hollow was a fast road to sleeping outside. So he worked. He worked the way drowning men swim, not with any particular hope, just with the specific terror of what happens if you stop. Wade Grayson was not a kind man. He was large and loud and smelled of diesel and cheap whiskey, and he had a way of standing in doorways with his arms crossed that made every room he entered feel smaller. He had worked the road for 20 years as a long-haul trucker before an accident took 2 fingers on his left hand and forced him into what he called land management, which mostly meant sitting in a heated office watching younger men break their bodies on his behalf. He paid Ethan in cash, always just enough, never more. "You're lucky I keep the lights on for you, boy," Grayson liked to say, and he said it the way people say things they believe completely. Ethan never argued. He needed the $43. He needed the next 43 after that. But the morning after his 19th birthday, something shifted. It wasn't a dramatic shift. It wasn't a moment of sudden courage or divine inspiration. It was something quieter and more dangerous than either of those things. It was the moment Ethan Walker simply ran out of patience with being poor. The doctor in the next town over had told him 3 weeks earlier that Maya needed a pulmonary function test. He'd said it in the careful, distanced way that doctors talk when they don't want to deliver bad news directly. Lots of words like monitoring and precautionary, and we just want to rule things out. But Ethan had watched his father die, and he understood the way adults talked around things that scared them. And what he heard underneath of all those careful words was, "Your sister's lungs are not right, and we don't know why yet. And if you don't find the money to find out, you may not like what happens next." The test cost $400. He had 43. He was standing at the edge of the far lot, the dead zone, the workers called it, the section of the scrapyard, where the truly unsalvageable material went to finish dying when he saw it. He almost missed it completely. It was buried under the collapsed frame of an old refrigeration unit, half covered by a tarp that had been there so long, it had bonded to the metal beneath it. He was moving the refrigeration unit with a crowbar when a piece of the tarp tore away and the morning light caught something underneath it. The curve of a fender. The unmistakable geometry of a tank. Ethan stopped moving. He crouched down. He pulled the rest of the tarp away slowly, the way you pull a bandage off a wound you're not sure you want to look at. And there it was. What was left of it anyway? What? The frame was warped and scorched black. The metal marked with the kind of damage that comes from sustained fire, not an accident, boss. The tank was cratered, not dented, not scratched, but actually cratered, the way metal looks when something has punched through it at high velocity. The engine casing was cracked in 3 places. The seat was gone entirely. Both wheels were present, but the spokes were snapped on the rear, and the front rim was bent into something closer to an oval than a circle. But the bones were there. Ethan had been around motorcycles since he was 6 years old. His father had kept a '78 Sportster in pieces in the corner of the trailer's small utility shed, and he'd worked on it on weekends with the focused, loving attention of a man who didn't have much else that was purely his. He'd let Ethan hand him tools before Ethan could properly read. He'd explained the relationship between the carburetor and the throttle to a 7-year-old in terms the 7-year-old somehow understood. Ethan knew motorcycles. And looking at what was left of this machine, broken and burned and violated by whatever violence had been done to it, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt like his father was standing next to him. "That's a knucklehead engine," he said out loud to no one. He reached out and touched the engine casing. "Hey!" The voice came from behind him, and Ethan straightened up fast the way you do when you've been caught somewhere you shouldn't be. It was Danny Rourke, one of the older yard workers, a man in his 50s with a permanent squint and a missing front tooth he'd never bothered to replace. Danny was standing 10 feet back. His hands were in his pockets. He was not moving closer. "What is that?" Ethan asked. "Nothing," Danny said immediately. "Leave it alone. That's a 46 knucklehead, maybe a 47. I can't tell from the frame damage, but the engine architecture is Ethan." Danny's voice was different now, not annoyed, something else. "Leave it alone. Where did it come from? It's been here longer than I have, longer than Grayson. It was here when this place was still a functioning yard." Danny took one step forward, then stopped himself. "There are things in this yard you don't touch. That is one of them. I'm telling you this as someone who has seen what happens to people who don't listen to that particular warning." Ethan looked at the burned knucklehead. Then he looked at Danny. "What happens?" Danny stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned around and walked away without answering. Ethan stood there for another 20 minutes. Then he went back to work. But he came back that night. He waited until the yard was empty, until the last truck had rattled out through the gate and Danny's taillight had disappeared down the highway. He brought a flashlight and a notebook and a pen, and he spent 2 hours crouched in the dead zone with a destroyed Harley, cataloging every component, assessing every piece of damage, working through the mechanical problem, the way his father had taught him, not from the outside in, but from the center out. Start with the heart of the thing. Start with the engine. Everything else is just the story the engine tells. The engine was salvageable. It would take money he didn't have, and time he didn't have, and parts that didn't exist in Black Hollow, Montana. It would require sourcing pre-war Harley components from salvage dealers across 3 states. It would require fabricating certain pieces entirely from raw materials because they simply weren't manufactured anymore. It would require skills he had and skills he would need to develop, and a level of sustained effort that left no room for anything else in his life. But it was salvageable. He sat back on his heels and shone the flashlight over the burned tank, over the cratered holes that punched through the steel like dark eyes. Someone had tried very hard to destroy this motorcycle. They hadn't quite managed it. He wrote 3 pages of notes in his notebook. Then he walked back to the trailer, checked on Maya still asleep. Fever slightly down and lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling with his hands folded on his chest like a man in a coffin. $400 for the pulmonary test. Unknown thousands for back rent that Grayson still counted against him in some running tally he never disclosed specifically. A restored 1946 Harley-Davidson knucklehead, if he could actually do it, if he could actually bring that machine back from the dead, was worth somewhere between $15,000 and $40,000 depending on the buyer and the story attached to it. He could find out the story later. Right now, he needed the money. He went to Wade Grayson the next morning before the yard opened, before the other workers arrived. He knocked on the office door and waited. Grayson opened it in a flannel shirt with a mug of coffee in his hand and the particular expression of a man who is already irritated by the interruption before he knows what it is. What? The burned motorcycle in the dead zone, Ethan said. The knucklehead. I want to restore it. Grayson looked at him for a moment without expression. No. I'll do it on my own time. Nothing on your clock. I'll use the utility shed behind. I said no. I need money for my sister's medical test, Mr. Grayson. I'm not asking you for it. I'm asking you to let me earn it. Something moved in Grayson's face. It was hard to read, not sympathy, exactly more like a calculation being performed. That bike's got a history, Grayson said. You don't want to know about it. I don't need to know about it. I need to restore it and sell it. It's not for sale. Ethan blinked. Then why is it in the dead zone? Because it's not for sale and it's not for touching and it's not yours, that's why. Grayson drank from his coffee mug and looked at Ethan over the rim. Drop it. Ethan dropped it for 4 days. On the 5th day, he went back to Grayson, this time with the notebook. He laid it open on the desk and walked Grayson through every component assessment, every sourcing possibility, every fabrication requirement. He showed him the numbers. He showed him the timeline. He showed him the research he'd done on comparable restored knuckleheads sold at auction in the last 3 years. 14,000 minimum, Ethan said. Probably more given the age and the pre-war components. If the Providence story is interesting, even more than that. Grayson looked at the notebook for a long time. Who taught you to do this? My father. Your father was a refinery worker. Before that, he was a mechanic. Ethan looked him directly in the eye. Same as his father before him. Grayson closed the notebook. He drummed his fingers on the desk once, twice. You restore it, I sell it, your back rent is cleared. That's the deal. Ethan said nothing for a moment. That's not enough. My sister needs... Take it or leave it. Ethan took it. He told himself he'd figure out the rest later. He told himself that a cleared debt was a foundation, and a foundation was something to build on. And right now, he didn't have anything close to a foundation. So this was still better than nothing. He told himself a lot of things that night, standing in the cold utility shed with the broken Harley while Maya coughed on the other side of the thin trailer wall. What he didn't tell himself, what he refused to think about, was the way Danny Rourke had looked at him in the dead zone, the way Grayson's jaw had tightened when Ethan said the word restore, the way 3 separate people in Black Hollow had crossed themselves almost involuntarily at the mention of the burned motorcycle in the dead zone. There are things in this yard you don't touch. Ethan put on his work gloves. He picked up his wrench. He got to work. The first week nearly broke him. Not the physical work. He was built for physical work. He had been built for it by 5 years of scrapyard labor, and before that by a childhood spent learning to be useful. What nearly broke him was the sourcing. Half the pre-war Harley components he needed simply did not exist in any accessible market. He spent his lunch breaks on a borrowed laptop at the gas station, calling salvage dealers in Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, talking his way past dismissal after dismissal, explaining what he had and what he needed, and offering future payment on parts he couldn't currently afford. Most of them hung up. 3 of them listened. One of them, an old Harley man named Cliff Beaumont, operating out of a barn near Billings, drove 3 hours to see the frame in person. Cliff stood over the burned knucklehead for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Ethan with an expression that was very difficult to read. Where did this come from? He asked quietly. It was here when I got here, Ethan said. You know what it is? I know what it might be, Cliff said. And if I'm right about what it might be, son, you have no idea what you're standing next to. Can you help me restore it or not? Cliff looked at the bike again. Something moved across his face, not quite fear, not quite reverence, something in between. I can get you the parts, he said finally. No charge. Ethan frowned. Why? Cliff pulled his jacket tighter against the Montana cold. Because if this is what I think it is, the old man said slowly, then this motorcycle has been waiting a very long time to run again. And the man who brings it back to life is going to need every advantage he can get. He walked back to his truck without another word. Ethan stood alone in the shed with the dead machine. The wind moved through the gaps in the wall. The single work light overhead swung gently on its cord, throwing slow shadows across the burned metal, across the cratered tank, across the engine casing where Ethan had found that first night. The very first night, something he hadn't told Grayson about. Something he hadn't told anyone about. A set of military dog tags welded into a small recess in the frame that had clearly been fabricated specifically to hide them. He'd pried them out carefully with a dental pick, and they were scorched but legible, the embossed letters still readable in the right light. The name on them was not a name he recognized. Maddox L.R. Below the name, no branch insignia, no serial number format that matched any military record Ethan could find in his late-night searches on the borrowed laptop. Just the name, and below it, in letters smaller than the others, nomads. He had put the dog tags in the breast pocket of his work jacket. They were still there against his chest every day while he worked. He didn't know why he kept them there. He only knew he wasn't ready to let go of them yet. The weeks turned into months. Maya's fever came back twice and receded twice, and Ethan counted the weeks until the back rent would be cleared and told himself it would be enough, even when he knew it wouldn't be enough. He ate whatever was cheapest at the gas station and lost 12 pounds over the winter, and his hands healed into new configurations of scar tissue that he barely noticed anymore. The motorcycle took shape. Slowly, incrementally, painfully, the way broken things rebuild it took shape. And somewhere in that process, something happened that Ethan had not anticipated and could not have explained to anyone who hadn't experienced it personally. He stopped restoring the motorcycle to sell it. He started restoring it because it deserved to be restored. Because somewhere beneath the burns and the bullet holes and the decades of deliberate destruction, there was a machine of extraordinary quality built with a care and precision that went far beyond factory specification. Someone had modified this motorcycle with expert hands. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. The engine tolerances were tighter than any stock knucklehead he had ever read about. The frame had custom reinforcements welded with a skill that made professional fabricators he consulted online openly skeptical that work this quality had been done in the 1940s. This was not a stock motorcycle. This was someone's masterpiece. And the person who had made it had been very, very good. Ethan found himself talking to it sometimes late at night when the cold was too deep for sleep, and Maya was quiet, and the only sound was the wind against the trailer and the occasional distant sound of highway traffic a mile to the east. "Who were you?" he asked it one night, running his thumb along the repaired tank over the welded patches that now covered the bullet holes. "What happened to you?" The motorcycle didn't answer, but 6 weeks later it did something better. It started. The engine caught on the third kick, a sound like the world remembering something it had forgotten, a deep mechanical thunder that rolled out across the black hollow night and climbed into the freezing air and kept climbing. Ethan stood over the running machine with both hands shaking. He was laughing. He hadn't actually laughed full and uncontrolled in 4 years. He stood there laughing in the cold with grease on his face and tears running down into his collar, and the engine ran, and the engine ran, and the engine ran. Maya appeared in the doorway of the shed. She was wrapped in her coat, eyes, wide hair uncombed, and she looked at the running motorcycle, and then at her brother's face, and she said very quietly, the way 12-year-olds say things when they understand something is important, but aren't sure exactly what it is, "Ethan, what did you just do?" He wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. He didn't know. But 60 miles away in a diner outside of Billings, an old man named Cliff Beaumont was sitting at the counter with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. His phone was on the table in front of him. He was staring at it. He had been staring at it for 10 minutes. Finally, he picked it up. He dialed a number he had not dialed in 7 years. It rang 4 times. A voice answered, low-controlled, carrying the particular quality of a man who had learned long ago to sound calm in all circumstances. "Cliff," the voice said, "it's been a while." "Victor," Cliff said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." Outside the window of the diner, the Montana night was very dark and very quiet. That was the last quiet night Black Hollow would have for a long, long time. Cliff Beaumont didn't sleep that night. He sat in his truck in the diner parking lot for 40 minutes after the call ended, staring at the dark highway, running the same thought through his head on a loop like a record that had gotten stuck. He had promised himself 7 years ago that he was done with all of it. Done with the names, the history, the weight of things that had happened before most of Black Hollow's current residents were born. He was an old man with bad knees and a barn full of motorcycle parts and absolutely no business inserting himself back into a world he had worked very hard to leave behind. But he had made the call anyway, because some things don't stay buried no matter how deep you dig the hole. Victor Grimm Maddox had not said much on the phone. That was his way. Cliff remembered that clearly even after 7 years. Victor was not a man who reacted to information immediately. He received it, he stored it, he processed it somewhere behind those flat, dark eyes that gave nothing away. And then, when he was ready, when he had turned the information over in his mind enough times to understand every angle of it, he acted. What he had said before the call ended was 4 words. "Send me the address." Cliff had sent it. Then he'd driven home and sat in his barn for 3 hours looking at the wall. Back in Black Hollow, Ethan Walker knew none of this. What Ethan knew on the morning after the engine first ran was that Wade Grayson was waiting for him at the yard gate at 6:15 a.m. with a particular expression on his face tight around the jaw, eyes slightly too still that Ethan had learned to read his trouble. "The bike run yet?" Grayson asked before Ethan could even say good morning. "Last night," Ethan said. Something moved in Grayson's face. "Good, I've got a buyer." Ethan stopped walking. "Already? Man called me, said he'd heard about the project." Grayson wouldn't meet his eyes directly, which was unusual. Grayson was the kind of man who used direct eye contact as a dominance tool, who stared at you a beat too long to make sure you understood the power arrangement. The fact that he wasn't doing it now registered somewhere in the back of Ethan's mind as significant. "He's offering $12,000 cash." "You told me 14 minimum," Ethan said. "You sat right there in that office, and we both looked at the comps, and you said," "I know what I said." "Then why are we talking about 12? "Because 12 in my hand today is better than 14, hypothetically." Grayson finally looked at him. "The deal was your back rent gets cleared. That stands. Take the win, Ethan." Ethan studied him for a long moment. "Who's the buyer?" "Collector out of Billings." "Name, does it matter?" "It matters to me." Grayson's jaw tightened. "Reston. Guy named Reston. He collects vintage iron. He heard about the project through the grapevine. He wants to move on it fast, that's all." Ethan nodded slowly. He went to work. He moved scrap metal and sorted copper wire and did everything he was supposed to do for 9 straight hours. And the entire time, one part of his brain was sitting very still and very quiet, turning the name Reston over and over like a stone you pick up and can't figure out why you picked up. He had never heard the name Reston in connection with vintage motorcycles, and he had spent 6 months reading everything ever written about vintage motorcycles. That evening, instead of going back to the shed, he borrowed the laptop from the gas station attendant, a teenager named Cody who owed him a favor for reasons not worth explaining, and he typed the name Reston into a search alongside the words "Vintage Harley in Montana and Collector." Nothing came back. He tried it without Montana. Still nothing. He tried Reston Billings, Montana by itself. What came back was a 3-year-old news article from a small regional paper about a civil asset forfeiture case. A man named Gerald Reston, described as a Billings area businessman, had had property seized as part of an investigation into racketeering and unlicensed firearms dealing. The investigation had been dropped 6 months later due to insufficient evidence. Ethan read the article twice. Then he closed the laptop and sat very still for a moment with his hands flat on the table. Then he went to find Danny Rourke. Danny was where he usually was after shift at the bar, which wasn't called anything officially, just the bar, a single room attached to the back of the gas station with 4 stools and a television that only received 2 channels. Danny was on his second beer, and he looked at Ethan the way a man looks at someone he was hoping wouldn't show up. "Sit down," Ethan said. "I'm already sitting." "Then stay sitting and talk to me." Ethan pulled out the stool beside him and sat down and looked directly at the older man. "Tell me about the bike, the real story, not the leave it alone speech, the actual story." Danny drank his beer. "Danny, you should have left it alone." "I didn't. It's done. The engine runs, and Grayson's got a buyer lined up named Reston who doesn't exist anywhere in the vintage motorcycle world, and I need to know what I'm dealing with." Ethan kept his voice level. "Please." Danny set his beer down. He looked at the 2-channel television for a moment. Then he exhaled through his nose and turned to face Ethan with the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally decided against his better judgment to set it down. 25 years ago, Danny said, this part of Montana had a problem. Not the kind of problem you call the police about, because the police were part of the problem. There was money moving, a lot of money, the kind that comes from sources you don't ask about, and the people moving it needed infrastructure. Legitimate-looking businesses, scrapyards, trucking operations. places where cash could change hands without leaving a trail. Ethan said nothing. He was very still. There was a man, Danny continued. Goes by Reaper, that's all. Anybody ever called him. He ran the Nomads chapter. That's a specific kind of Hell's Angels chapter. The ones without a fixed territory. The ones who ride between charters in answer to no one except the national leadership. Reaper was, Danny paused, choosing words carefully. He wasn't what people think when they think Hell's Angels. He wasn't a criminal in the way most people understand criminals. He was a veteran, Marine, 2 tours, came back changed in ways that war changes people, but not broken, more like clarified. He had a code, he enforced it. What kind of code? The kind that says you don't touch civilians, you don't involve people who didn't choose this life, you don't steal from working people. Danny looked at him. The kind of code that made certain other people in certain positions very uncomfortable because it put limits on how far the business could expand. Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. What happened to him? He was set up. Someone inside fed information to people on the outside, businessmen, a couple of sheriffs on payroll, and Reaper rode into an ambush out on Route 12 one night. Danny picked up his beer again. They didn't find a body, but they found his bike eventually dragged into the Grayson yard and dumped in the dead zone, and nobody went near it after that because everybody with any sense understood what it meant. He looked at Ethan. It was a message. The bar was very quiet. The dog tags, Ethan said. Danny turned to look at him sharply. What? I found dog tags inside the frame. First night, a hidden recess fabricated to conceal them. Mad XLR and the word nomads. Danny had gone very still. You took them out, he asked quietly. Yes. And you still have them? Yes. Danny set his beer down very carefully. When he spoke again, his voice was different, lower, with an edge to it that hadn't been there before. Ethan, listen to me. The man on that bike, Lucas Maddox Reaper, he had a younger brother, Victor. Victor Maddox is currently the national president of the Hells Angels Nomads chapter. He has been looking for proof of what happened to his brother for 25 years. Danny leaned in slightly. If he finds out that bike has been restored, that someone opened up that frame, Grayson already has a buyer, Ethan said. Reston, the bike is being sold before Victor Maddox knows it exists. The color left Danny Rourke's face. Say that again. Grayson told me this morning, buyer named Reston Cash wants to move fast. Ethan watched the older man's reaction carefully. You know that name? Danny stood up from the bar stool. For a man his age and size, he moved with a sudden urgency that was almost alarming. He put both hands on the bar and leaned on them and closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked like a man trying very hard not to fall. Gerald Reston, he said. He was one of the men involved in the setup, one of the businessmen who paid to have Lucas killed. He opened his eyes. If Reston gets that motorcycle, whatever evidence might be attached to it disappears forever. And then someone is going to start wondering whether the kid who restored it knows anything. Whether the kid who had access to that frame for 6 months might have found something. The word evidence landed in Ethan's chest like a dropped weight. There's something in the bike, Ethan said. It wasn't a question. He'd felt it for weeks without being able to name it, that sense that the machine contained more than mechanics, that he was restoring not just an engine, but a story. There might be, Danny said. There might be nothing. I don't know, but Reston clearly thinks there is, or he wouldn't be moving this fast. Ethan stood up. I need to look at the bike again. Ethan, I need to look at it tonight. He didn't wait for Danny's response. He was out the door and across the gravel lot and into the utility shed within 4 minutes, and he didn't turn on the overhead light. He used the small focus beam of his work flashlight, instead moving it systematically over every surface of the restored motorcycle, every joint and seam and welded connection. His father's voice in his head, start with the heart of the thing. Start with the engine. Everything else is just the story the engine tells. He worked outward from the engine. He checked every panel, every access point. He checked the inside of the tank. Empty, nothing. He checked beneath the fender, mounts. He ran his fingers along the underside of the frame rails, feeling for anything that shouldn't be there. Any irregularity in the metal, any seam that didn't match the surrounding structure. He was under the bike, lying on his back on the cold concrete, with the flashlight angled up at the frame when he found it. It was welded to the underside of the lower frame rail near the rear axle mount. Not the kind of weld you'd notice unless you were specifically looking for it blended into the surrounding metalwork, with obvious skill clearly done by the same hands that had built the rest of the custom modifications. A capsule, small enough to fit in his closed fist. Steel. He got up and got his cutting tools and spent 22 minutes carefully opening the welds without damaging whatever was inside. His hands were completely steady. He had no idea how they were completely steady because the rest of him was vibrating like a tuning fork. The capsule opened. Inside, sealed in oilskin, were documents, photographs, a handwritten ledger with dates and amounts and names going back to 1987. A cassette tape in a small plastic case labeled in handwriting with a date and a location. He spread them on the workbench under the flashlight. The names in the ledger meant nothing to him. At first, they were just names attached to numbers attached to dates. But two of them appeared repeatedly circled in different ink as though added at different times. One name he recognized from his search, Reston. The other was a name he had seen on a brass plaque outside an office building 40 miles away, in the county seat, the kind of plaque that listed names of people who donated enough money to have their names on brass plaques. Sheriff Harold Briggs retired, says Briggs retired. Currently the deputy mayor of Cascade County. Ethan sat on his work stool and held the documents under the flashlight for a long time. Outside, the wind had picked up. He could hear it working at the corners of the shed, pushing through the gaps in the siding. In the trailer, Maya was asleep. The scrapyard was dark and empty. He was completely alone with 25 years of buried truth. He thought about Grayson. He thought about the sale happening. How fast, how deliberately fast, the urgency of it. Reston's cash offer below market value. He thought about what Danny had said. If Reston gets that motorcycle, whatever evidence might be attached to it disappears forever. And then someone is going to start wondering whether the kid who restored it knows anything. He put the documents back in the oilskin. He put the oilskin inside his jacket against his chest next to the dog tags. Then he sat very still for a moment and made a decision. He was not going to let Wade Grayson sell this motorcycle to Gerald Reston. He wasn't fully sure what he was going to do instead. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have resources or allies or any leverage of any kind except the thing currently pressed against his chest. What he had was a 19-year-old's specific brand of stubbornness, the kind that comes not from stupidity, but from having been backed into so many corners that you've stopped being afraid of corners. He locked the shed. He went inside. He checked on Maya, who was breathing evenly. Fever down again, looking young and unbothered in her sleep, in the way that made his chest hurt with a love he couldn't find words for. He sat down at the cable spool table. He opened his notebook to a clean page, and he began to write down every name, every date, every number from the ledger from memory in case anything happened to the documents themselves. He wrote for 2 hours. When he was done, he folded the pages carefully and hid them in the lining of Maya's winter coat, the one place he was certain Grayson or anyone else would never think to look. Then he lay down on his cot. He did not sleep. At some point close to 4 a.m, a sound worked its way through the trailer wall, distant from the direction of the highway, coming and going with the wind. He lay there listening to it, trying to identify it, and after a minute or two, he placed it. Motorcycles. Not close. Miles away, still moving in a direction he couldn't determine. He lay there listening until the sound faded entirely. Could have been anything. Travelers, a club running a night road through Montana, which was not unusual. He told himself it was nothing. He stared at the ceiling. In the breast pocket of his jacket, the dog tags and the oilskin felt heavier than they should have. 3 hours later, Wade Grayson knocked on the trailer door at 7:15, a full hour before Ethan's scheduled shift, with 2 men standing behind him that Ethan had never seen before. They were large, and they were still, and they were wearing the particular expression of men who are waiting for something they expect to get. "The bike," Grayson said without preamble, without greeting. "We're moving it today." Ethan looked at the 2 men behind Grayson. "Today," he repeated. "Reston wants it this morning. Truck's coming at 10. Ethan stood in the doorway of the trailer in his socks, in his work pants, in the jacket with everything hidden inside it, and he looked at Wade Grayson, and he thought about 25 years in a dead man's dog tags and a 12-year-old girl asleep 10 feet behind him. "I need to finish the final inspection," he said carefully. "There are a few mechanical things I haven't signed off on. Safety items. If I sell a buyer a bike that's not mechanically sound and something happens..." 10 o'clock, Grayson said. "Be ready." He turned and walked away. The two men stood there for one beat longer than necessary, looking at Ethan with flat, patient eyes. Then they turned and followed Grayson. Ethan closed the trailer door. He leaned his back against it. His heart was hammering. His mind was moving fast, sorting through options, discarding most of them. He had less than 3 hours. He had no phone of his own. He had a notebook, some documents, a set of dog tags, and a motorcycle that he had spent 6 months bringing back from the dead. He also had one name, Victor Grimm Maddox. He didn't have a way to reach him, but Cliff Beaumont did. Ethan put his boots on. He kissed his sister on the forehead without waking her. He stepped outside into the cold Montana morning. He started walking toward the highway. He had 3 hours. He wasn't sure if it was enough. He wasn't sure of anything except this Lucas Maddox had hidden that capsule in his motorcycle 25 years ago, knowing someone might find it someday, knowing the truth deserved to survive him even if he didn't. The least Ethan Walker could do was make sure it reached the right hands. He walked faster. Ethan walked the highway's shoulder for 20 minutes before a truck going toward Billings slowed, and the driver, a weathered ranch hand named Pete, who didn't ask questions, gave him a ride as far as the junction where the old highway met Route 9. From there, it was another 1.5 miles on foot to the payphone outside the Sundown Motel, the last working payphone in a 40-mile radius, a relic that survived only because the motel owner was 83 years old and didn't believe in cell phones. Ethan had the number he needed. He'd memorized it from the registration paperwork Cliff Beaumont had left in the shed the day he brought parts an old habit from his father, who had believed that anything worth knowing was worth knowing by heart. He picked up the receiver. He dialed. It rang 6 times. He counted every one. Then Cliff picked up. "Yeah, it's Ethan Walker, Black Hollow. I need you to listen to me, and I need you to not ask a lot of questions because I don't have a lot of time." A pause. When Cliff spoke again, his voice was different, awake, careful. "How much time?" "Grayson's got a buyer. Name's Gerald Reston. Truck comes at 10 to take the bike." Ethan kept his voice flat and even. "I found the capsule, Cliff. I opened it. I know what's in it." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 4 seconds. Long enough for Ethan to understand that Cliff Beaumont had known about the capsule, had suspected it at minimum, had given those parts for free, not out of sentiment, but out of something more complicated than sentiment. "You still have it?" Cliff asked. "On me, right now." "The documents are intact." "Yes, I need you to contact Victor Maddox. I need you to do it right now. Tell him what's happening. Tell him Reston is moving to take possession of the bike this morning, and if that happens, everything Lucas left behind disappears." Another silence, shorter this time. "Victor already knows about the bike, Ethan." The words hit him like cold water. "What?" "I called him," Cliff said quietly. "The night the engine ran, I heard it from my barn sound carry something different at that temperature, that altitude. I knew what it meant. I called him that same night." Ethan stood at the payphone with the receiver pressed hard against his ear, and the cold morning air coming through the gaps in the motel's exterior wall behind him, and he recalibrated everything he thought he understood about the situation. "Then where is he?" he said. "He's coming." "Cliff, the truck gets there at 10. That's less than 3 hours." "I know. That's not enough time for Ethan." Cliff's voice was very calm. "The way deep water is calm. Victor Maddox has been waiting 25 years for this. He is not going to be late." The line went quiet. Ethan walked back to Black Hollow faster than he'd walked away from it. His mind was working the whole time, sorting through what he knew and what he didn't know, trying to find the edges of a situation that kept expanding every time he thought he'd mapped it. Victor Maddox already knew about the bike, which meant Victor Maddox had known for weeks, had been monitoring, calculating, waiting with that particular patience that Cliff's voice had communicated so clearly, which meant the phone call Cliff had made 7 years ago that he'd referenced, without explaining, was a channel that had stayed open even in dormancy, and that everything Ethan had been doing in that shed for 6 months had been observed from a distance by a man he'd never met. That thought produced a feeling he couldn't name precisely, not quite violated, not quite reassured, something between the two. He got back to the yard at 8:40. Grayson's office light was on. The 2 men from the morning were nowhere visible, which somehow felt worse than if they'd been standing right there. Ethan went to the shed. He unlocked it. He stood in front of the restored knucklehead for a moment, ticking over quietly at idle, because he'd started it before leaving the warmth of the engine filling the small space, and he put his hand on the tank. "Not today," he said quietly. He locked the shed from the inside. Then he sat down on his work stool and he waited. At 9:20, someone knocked on the shed door. Not Grayson's knock, too soft for Grayson. "It's Danny." Ethan unlocked the door. Danny came in fast and closed it behind him, and he looked like a man who had not slept in several days compressed into the span of one morning. "There are 4 men in the yard," Danny said. "I don't recognize any of them. They came in a panel van about 20 minutes ago, and they've been walking the perimeter since. These aren't Reston's moving crew, Ethan. Moving crew doesn't walk perimeters." "What does walking a perimeter mean to you?" Ethan asked, though he already knew. "It means they're making sure nothing leaves that shouldn't leave. It means Reston isn't confident this is going to be a clean exchange." Danny looked at the motorcycle. "It means somebody told him about the capsule." The word landed between them. "Grayson," Ethan said. Danny's face confirmed it without a word. Ethan thought about the deal he'd made with Grayson, the back rent, the cleared debt, the offer that had always been too neat, too simple, the solution that appeared exactly when he needed one and had never felt entirely right. Grayson had known about the bike's history, had known it long enough to have an opinion about what should happen to it. And when a 19-year-old kid with no leverage and no options had walked into his office with a notebook full of restoration plans, Grayson had seen something useful. He didn't want the bike restored to sell it, Ethan said slowly. He wanted it restored to find out if the capsule was real, to confirm it existed, and then hand it to Reston intact. Danny said nothing, which was confirmation enough. "Does he know I found it?" "I don't know what he knows," Danny said, "but those men outside know something." Ethan stood up. The documents were still inside his jacket. The dog tags were still against his chest. He looked at the door, then at the shed's single small window on the far wall. Too small to climb through, not that it mattered. "How much time?" he asked. "Reston's truck is 20 minutes out, according to the call I overheard Grayson take." 20 minutes. 4 men outside, the documents on his body and the bike in the room with him, and absolutely no cavalry on the horizon. Except, he thought about what Cliff had said. Victor Maddox has been waiting 25 years for this. He is not going to be late. He needed to buy time. He looked at Danny. "Can you stall Grayson?" "For how long?" "As long as you can." Danny looked at him with an expression that contained layers: resignation, reluctant respect. The wariness of a man who'd spent 25 years staying uninvolved, watching things he should have stood up about go wrong. "You're a stubborn damn kid," Danny said. "Yes, sir." Danny went out. Ethan stayed. He could hear the yard through the shed walls. Normal sounds, first the creak of the gate, the scrape of metal on concrete. Then voices too low to make out words. Then Grayson's voice, distinct, even muffled, with that particular carrying quality of a man accustomed to being listened to. Then the voices stopped. The quiet was worse than the noise. At 9:47, the shed door handle moved. Not a knock, just the handle testing. It stopped when it found the lock. "Walker," Grayson's voice, controlled but with something underneath it. "Open the door." Ethan said nothing. "I know you're in there. The bike needs to be ready for transport. Open the door right now." Ethan stood very still with both hands flat on his knees and his eyes on the door. "Ethan," a different voice now, one of the men he didn't recognize, with a flat Midwest accent and the kind of tone that was practiced and professional and meant to communicate inevitability. "Nobody's going to get hurt here. This is a business transaction. Open the door and step away from the motorcycle." "I want to see the paperwork," Ethan said. First words he'd spoken. His own voice sounded strange to him, steady, which surprised him. "Bill of sale, legal transfer of ownership. Bring me the paperwork and I'll open the door." A pause. "That's not how this works," the flat voice said. "It's how it works for me," Ethan said. "I restored this motorcycle, my labor, my materials, my 6 months. I want to see a legal bill of sale before it moves an inch." Another pause, longer. Then footsteps moving away from the door. He had bought maybe 10 minutes, maybe less. He looked at the knucklehead. The engine was still running its deep idle, filling the shed with sound and warmth. Fully functional, fully restored. Every original detail intact, and he'd done it right. He knew he'd done it right because the machine had told him so, in the way machines tell you, in the way they run when they're happy and fight you when they're not. Lucas Maddox had built something extraordinary, and then someone had murdered him for it. Ethan put his hand on the throttle, not to do anything, just to hold it, just to feel the engine's pulse through his palm. He heard the sound at 9:53. It started as something his brain filed under weather, a distant rumble, the kind that precedes a storm system, rolling in off the Rockies, low and pervasive, and felt in the chest more than heard with the ears. But it didn't behave like thunder. It didn't swell and peak and recede. It built steadily, consistently, growing with the specific logic of approach rather than atmosphere. His hand tightened on the throttle. The rumble became a roar. Then the roar became something that had no adequate word, a wall of sound moving across Black Hollow, like a force of nature, like something the landscape itself was generating, a vibration that got into the metal walls of the shed and resonated there and wouldn't stop. Outside, all voices ceased. Complete, total, absolute silence from the yard. The kind of silence that happens when every person in a space simultaneously forgets what they were about to say. Then Grayson's voice, very quietly, with something in it Ethan had never heard from the man before. Fear. What in the... The motorcycle roar crested and held, and the ground was actually vibrating, now actually transmitting physical energy through the concrete into the soles of Ethan's boots. And he stood up from the stool and moved to the shed door and unlocked it and pushed it open and stepped outside. The highway was completely full, not partially, not in the oncoming lane, completely both lanes and the shoulder as far as he could see in either direction, a column of motorcycles riding in formation with a precision that belonged to the military, not to any civilian context he had ever witnessed. Headlights on in the gray morning, riding in pairs perfectly spaced, perfectly aligned. He stopped counting at 50 and realized counting was beside the point. The four men who had been walking the perimeter were completely still. Two of them had backed up against the yard fence without apparently noticing they'd moved. The panel van was parked near the gate and its doors were closed and no one was coming out of it. Grayson was standing 12 feet from Ethan, and when Ethan looked at him, the man's face had the particular quality of someone experiencing something their body recognizes as dangerous before their mind has finished processing it. The formation slowed, then stopped. 240 motorcycles idling together produced a sound like the earth clearing its throat. A single rider separated from the front of the column and came through the scrapyard gate at walking pace and stopped in the open space between Ethan and Grayson. The man who swung off the motorcycle was in his late 40s, built the way men are built when physical conditioning has been a non-negotiable priority for 30 years. He moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had been in enough situations to understand that unnecessary motion is a form of vulnerability. He wore a kootie over a black jacket, the patches of the Nomads chapter clear, even from a distance, and the President rocker across the bottom. He looked at Grayson first, just looked at him, said nothing. Grayson actually took a step backward. Then Victor Grim Maddox turned and looked at Ethan Walker. The look lasted a long time. It was the kind of look that takes inventory, not of clothing or xiao or anything external, but of something interior, some quality that either registers or doesn't, and which Victor Maddox had apparently spent a lifetime learning to identify. "You're the mechanic," Victor said. Not a question. "Yes, sir," Ethan said. Victor looked past him at the open shed door, at the idling knucklehead just visible inside its engine, turning over with that deep, distinctive rhythm. Something happened to his face. It was the smallest possible change, a tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible movement at the jaw, but in a face that gave away almost nothing, it landed like a shout. "That's his idol," Victor said quietly, almost to himself. Lucas had the carburetor tuned to that exact. He stopped, cleared his throat once. Nobody else could ever get it to idle like that. Ethan said nothing. He understood instinctively that this was not a moment for words. "How did you know?" Victor asked. "The carb setting. That's not stock. That's not in any manual." "I didn't know," Ethan said honestly. "The engine told me where it wanted to be. I just listened." Victor looked at him for another long moment. Then something shifted in the yard, a change in energy, quick and unmistakable. One of the men from the panel van had moved to the driver's door. A quiet attempt, careful, probably hoping no one would notice in the larger chaos of 240 motorcycles blocking the highway. Victor didn't turn around. He simply raised his right-hand index finger extended and made one small circular motion. 4 Hells Angels came off their bikes and had the van surrounded before the driver's window finished rolling down. The driver put his hands on the steering wheel very slowly and looked straight ahead. "Nobody leaves," Victor said quietly, still looking at Ethan. Not yet. He walked toward the shed. He stopped in the doorway. He stood there looking at the restored knucklehead for 30 seconds without speaking, and the whole yard held its breath with him, 240 men on motorcycles, and Ethan and Grayson, frozen where he stood, and Danny Rourke watching from the corner of the parts shed with his arms at his sides. When Victor turned back around, his eyes were red at the rims. He wasn't crying. The specific discipline of the man wouldn't permit that. Not here, not in front of all of this, but the emotion was right there at the surface, barely contained, real and enormous, and 25 years deep. You brought him back, Victor said. Ethan reached into his jacket. He brought out the oilskin first, held it out. Victor took it, opened it slowly, looked at the documents, the photographs, the ledger. His expression as he went through them was unreadable, except that his jaw tightened progressively, with each page a slow accumulation of controlled rage. Then Ethan reached back into his jacket and brought out the dog tags. He held them out on his palm. Victor looked at them for a long moment without moving. Then he reached out and took them with both hands, closing his fingers around them, and he held them against his chest and closed his eyes, and the only sound was 240 engines at idle and the Montana wind moving over all of it. When he opened his eyes, they were flat and dark and had moved into a different register, entirely past grief, into something older and quieter and far more dangerous. He turned to look at Grayson. Grayson had gone the color of old concrete. You and I, Victor said to him very softly, are going to have a conversation. It was not a sentence that required a response. He looked back at Ethan. The capsule, he said, you opened it, you read everything. Yes? And you kept it. When you could have handed it to Grayson and taken your money and stayed out of all of it, you kept it. Ethan met his eyes. It wasn't mine to give away. Victor was quiet for a moment. No, he said, it wasn't. He looked at the shed one more time, at the running knucklehead, at the machine that had come back from the dead because a broke 19-year-old kid in a dying Montana town had decided a broken thing deserved to be whole again. Then he looked at Ethan with an expression that had no performance in it whatsoever. How old are you? He asked. 19. Victor nodded slowly. Something passed through his face, recognition maybe, or memory, or the particular feeling of watching someone remind you of something you'd forgotten about yourself a long time ago. 19, he repeated. He said it the way you say a word that suddenly means more than it used to. Behind him, 240 engines idled on. And in the panel van by the gate, Gerald Reston's men sat with their hands visible and their options gone, and 25 years of buried truth sat in Victor Maddox's hands in an oilskin pouch, and the morning was just beginning to understand what it had become. The conversation between Victor Maddox and Wade Grayson lasted 11 minutes. Ethan didn't hear most of it. Victor had walked Grayson into the office, not roughly, not with any visible force, just with the particular gravitational authority of a man whose presence alone constituted a kind of pressure. And two nomads had positioned themselves outside the office door in the casual way that meant the door wasn't going to open until Victor wanted it to open, too. Ethan stood in the yard with the knucklehead's engine still running behind him in the shed and 240 motorcycles at his back, and tried to process the last 40 minutes of his life in some coherent order. Danny Rourke appeared beside him quietly, the way Danny had always moved, without announcement, without drama. You all right? Danny asked. I don't know yet, Ethan said honestly. Danny looked at the line of Hell's Angels stretching back down the highway. His expression had the quality of a man watching something he'd told himself for 25 years would never actually happen. He looks like him, Danny said quietly. Victor, same way of standing. Lucas had that same... He stopped, cleared his throat. You did a good thing, son. Ethan didn't respond to that. He wasn't sure what he'd done yet. He'd acted on instinct and information, and a 19-year-old's refusal to accept the options he'd been handed, and whether that constituted a good thing or just a lucky thing, felt like a question whose answer was still being determined. The office door opened at 10:14. Grayson came out first. He was still physically intact, no marks, nothing visible, but something had happened to the architecture of his posture. He'd come in as a man who owned things, and he came out as a man remembering that ownership is conditional. He didn't look at Ethan. He walked directly to the far side of the yard and stood there facing the fence. Victor came out behind him and crossed to where Ethan was standing. He moved with the same deliberate economy as before, but something had shifted slightly in his expression, The controlled rage had settled into something colder and more purposeful. Grayson confirmed he was working with Reston, Victor said. Has been there for 3 years since Reston heard rumors the bike might be on this property. Grayson's job was to make sure nothing left this yard that shouldn't leave. He paused. And then you showed up wanting to restore it. He saw an opportunity, Ethan said. He saw a way to let someone else do the dangerous work and collect from both sides. Victor looked at him steadily. He didn't count on you actually finding the capsule, or on you being the kind of person who does something with it other than hand it over and take the money. What happens to him now? Victor was quiet for a moment. That's not your concern. It was said without hostility. It was simply a boundary stated cleanly, and Ethan understood it as such and didn't push it. The men in the van, Ethan said instead. They're having a conversation with some of my people. They'll be released when we're satisfied they've said everything useful. Victor watched Ethan's face as he said it. No one is going to be hurt who doesn't have a very specific reason to be hurt. I need you to hear that. I hear it, Ethan said, and mostly he believed it. The documents, Victor continued, the ledger, the photographs, the tape. I've had people looking for this evidence for over 2 decades. Do you understand what it proves? It proves Reston and Briggs paid to have your brother killed. It documents money transfers going back to 1987. It has dates, amounts, names. Ethan met his eyes. The cassette tape, I'm guessing that's a recorded conversation. Lucas was careful. He built the evidence before he rode into that ambush. Something moved through Victor's face. He always was the smart one, he said quietly. Then he caught himself, pulled back from wherever that sentence was taking him. Yes, the tape is a recording. Lucas made it 6 days before he died. It has both Reston and Briggs on it explicitly discussing the arrangement. He paused. Briggs is currently the deputy mayor of Cascade County. I know, Ethan said. I looked him up. Victor studied him for a moment with that inventory-taking look. You looked up a lot of things, he said. I had 6 months and a borrowed laptop and a motorcycle that kept telling me it wasn't just a motorcycle. Ethan shrugged slightly. I paid attention. Before Victor could respond, a rider came up from the column, young mid-20s with a sergeant-at-arms patch, and the specific urgency of someone delivering information that can't wait. Victor? The rider leaned in and spoke quietly. Ethan caught 2 words, Reston and moving. Victor's expression didn't change, but his posture did a subtle realignment like a compass needle finding north. How far out? Victor asked. 20 minutes. He's got 6 vehicles, not moving crew. The air in the yard changed. Ethan felt it, a collective shift in attention. 240 men recalibrating simultaneously, a subtle tightening like a fist closing. No panic, no disorder, just readiness reorganizing itself. Gerald Reston is coming here personally, Victor said to Ethan. It wasn't a question. He must know the exchange didn't happen as planned, Ethan said. And if his men in the van have gone silent, he's coming to clean up. Victor turned to the rider. Tell Jackson to redeploy the column. Standard perimeter, 2/3 coverage. Leave the gate open. He paused. I want him to drive in. The rider went. Ethan looked at Victor. You want him to come inside the yard. I want him to choose to come inside the yard, Victor said. There's a difference. That was the moment Ethan understood something about Victor Maddox, that the stories and the reputation and the title hadn't communicated. The man was not primarily physical. He was strategic. The size and the history and the 240 riders were the instrument, but the mind behind them was something else entirely. Lucas had been the smart one, Victor had said, with love and grief and a brother's particular pride. But Victor wasn't without his own kind of intelligence. Over the next 15 minutes, the yard reorganized around Ethan in ways that looked to an untrained eye like casual dispersal riders moving, repositioning, some coming off their bikes and standing in apparently informal clusters. But the coverage was precise. Every exit point was managed. The gate stood open and empty and inviting. Danny came back to stand near Ethan. You should get inside, he said quietly. Take your sister and get inside the trailer and lock it. Maya doesn't know any of this is happening, Ethan said. Good, keep it that way. I'm not going inside. Danny looked at him. Ethan, this started because of me, Ethan said. I'm not going to stand in a locked room while it finishes. Danny opened his mouth, then closed it. He stayed. Reston's convoy arrived at 10:41. 3 black SUVs and 3 pickup trucks, moving in the tight formation of people who'd coordinated their travel deliberately. They came through the open gate, and the lead SUV stopped 20 feet inside the yard and sat there for a moment with its engine running, the driver apparently processing what he was seeing, the scope of the presence that filled the property and the highway beyond it. Then the door opened. Gerald Reston was in his mid-60s, thick through the chest, with the groomed look of a man who had spent decades presenting himself as legitimate. He wore a heavy coat and he stepped out of the SUV with the deliberate confidence of a man accustomed to situations where his money defined the terms. That confidence lasted approximately 4 seconds. He looked at the yard. He looked at the highway. He did the count the same way everyone did, the same involuntary recalculation, the same moment of comprehending that the situation he'd driven into was categorically different from the situation he'd been told he was driving into. Then he saw Victor. The two men looked at each other across the scrapyard. 25 years collapsed into the space between them. Reston's jaw worked once. He looked at the men around him, then back at Victor, and Ethan watched him go through the stages of a man whose options are disappearing in real-time calculation, then recalculation, then the particular stillness of someone who has arrived at a very small number of remaining choices. Victor walked toward him slowly, not fast, not aggressive, just steady the way water moves toward the lowest point. "Gerald," he said. Reston said nothing. "You drove a long way this morning," Victor said. "I appreciate that. It saves us both some time." "I don't know what you think The ledger," Victor said. "The photographs. The recording Lucas made 6 days before you had him killed." He stopped 10 feet from Reston. "We have all of it?" We've had it since this morning." Something went out of Reston's face. Not the color that had gone already. Something deeper. Some essential structural quality like load-bearing walls deciding they were done. "I want a lawyer," Reston said. His voice had changed completely from whatever it had been a moment ago. "That's a very good idea," Victor said. "And I want you to have one. I want every part of this to go through the proper legal process. Because unlike you, I actually want this in front of a court." He reached into his jacket and withdrew the oilskin, held it up. 25 years, Gerald, my brother, his club, the money you stole, the men you paid, the sheriffs, the cover-up." His voice was completely level. That was somehow worse than if it hadn't been. "I want a jury to hear the recording. I want them to hear your voice. I want everything you built on top of his death to be taken apart piece by piece in public." Reston's jaw tightened. "You have no idea what you're—" "Sit down," Victor said. The words were quiet. They were also completely absolute. Reston sat down on the running board of his own SUV. One of the nomads produced zip ties, legal civilian zip ties, the kind you get at a hardware store. Reston's men from the 3 SUVs and 3 pickups were handled with efficient, practiced calm. Nobody was roughed up. Nobody was threatened beyond the thoroughly adequate threat of their circumstances. Within 4 minutes, every one of them was seated on the ground near their vehicles with their hands secured. Ethan stood and watched all of it and felt something strange moving through him. Not satisfaction, exactly not triumph. Something quieter, something that felt almost like the feeling he'd had the night the engine first ran, standing over the running knucklehead, with tears on his face, the sense of something that had been wrong for a very long time becoming right. Victor came back to him. "The county sheriff is 20 minutes out," Victor said. "Real sheriff, not Briggs, not anyone connected to Briggs. A woman named Carla Tate who has been building a case against Reston's operation independently for 4 years and has been waiting for the piece that would make it complete." "You called her," Ethan said. "I called her 40 minutes ago, before Reston arrived." Victor looked at him steadily. "Everything I do goes through proper legal channels where proper legal channels exist. You should know that about us." Ethan nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "Then the back rent. Grayson said if I restored the bike, my debt was cleared." "Your debt to Grayson is cleared," Victor said. "Grayson's debts to other people are a separate matter." "I need money for my sister's medical test," Ethan said. He said it straight, no lead-up, no softening. He was too tired for softening. "Pulmonary function test, $400. I've been working toward it for months and He stopped, steadied himself. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm telling you the situation because you asked me earlier why I restored the bike. And the honest answer is I restored it to save my sister's home and her health, and I think you should know that." Victor looked at him for a long moment. "How old is she?" 12. "What's her name?" "Maya." Victor turned away for a moment. He looked at the shed, at the open door, at the knucklehead still running inside its engine, turning over in that distinctive idle that he had recognized from 30 feet away because it was his dead brother's engine and his dead brother's hands that had built it, and some muscle memory in him had known it before his mind caught up. When he turned back, his eyes were very direct. "The $400, he said, "that's taken care of as of right now. One of my men will get you cash before we leave this yard." He held up one hand before Ethan could speak. "But I need you to listen to me carefully because there's something I need to tell you, and I need you to hear it without arguing." Ethan said nothing. He listened. "When the capsule evidence goes to Sheriff Tate, this story is going to become public. The restoration, the evidence, the history of what happened to my brother. Your name is attached to all of it." Victor's voice was even and deliberate. "Reston has people we don't know about yet. People with their own interests in this staying buried. Until this is fully in the legal system and those people are identified, you and your sister are not safe here." The words settled into Ethan's chest like stones dropped into still water. "How long?" he asked. "Weeks, maybe less. We move fast once we move." Victor looked at him. "I have a property in Wyoming, secure, staffed, comfortable. You and your sister would stay there while this processes. She'd have access to medical care, real care, not a $400 test, everything she needs." He paused. "I'm not asking you to leave Black Hollow forever. I'm asking you to be smart for the next few weeks." Ethan thought about Maya asleep in the trailer. Maya and her grocery receipt birthday card, and her fever that came and went, and her lungs that a doctor had been carefully worried about in the way doctors are careful about things that scare them. "She doesn't know any of this is happening," he said again. "She's going to wake up and—" "Then go wake her up yourself," Victor said simply. "Tell her what you want to tell her. I'll have someone help you pack what you need. You don't leave until you're ready." It was Ethan realized the first time in a very long time that an adult with power over his circumstances had offered him a choice instead of a condition. He felt the strangeness of it like a physical sensation. He looked at Victor. "Why?" he asked. "Not the logistics. Why do you actually care what happens to us?" Victor was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his voice had dropped into something more personal than anything he'd shown in the entire morning. "Because my brother built that motorcycle with his own hands and hid the truth inside it and trusted that someday someone would find it and do the right thing with it." He looked at Ethan. "And the person who found it was a 19-year-old kid with bleeding hands and a sick sister who chose, when he could have looked the other way, to do the right thing." He paused. "Lucas would have liked you." Ethan didn't trust himself to speak for a moment. He looked at the shed, at the running knucklehead, at the machine he'd spent 6 months rebuilding piece by piece in the cold with his father's voice in his head and $43 in his pocket, and a sister on the other side of a thin wall. "I need to go talk to Maya," he said. "Go," Victor said. Ethan walked toward the trailer. Behind him, he heard Victor say something to the rider beside him, a quiet instruction, and then the sound of a zipper and the soft weight of something being set down. He turned. Victor was setting a duffel bag on the ground. "That's not for the medical test," Victor said. "That's separate. The medical test is $400 cash, which my man Jimmy will give you before you leave." He nodded at the duffel. "That is for 6 months of work, for doing what nobody else in this town or any other town had the skill or the guts to do." His voice was very direct. "Don't argue with me about it." Ethan looked at the bag. He looked at Victor. He thought about the night he'd sat at the cable spool table with $43 and his head in his hands, counting what wasn't there, listening to his sister breathe on the other side of the wall. He picked up the bag. It was heavy in a way that meant something. He didn't open it. Not yet. He just held it and breathed and nodded once, and Victor nodded back, and between them passed the specific understanding of two people who have both lived inside real poverty and real loss, and know that certain things cannot be adequately expressed through language. Then Ethan turned and walked to the trailer door and knocked softly so as not to startle her. Maya's voice came from inside, still half asleep. "Ethan." "Yeah, Bug. It's me." He opened the door. "Get dressed. I need to tell you something." He stepped inside. Outside, Sheriff Carla Tate's vehicle turned onto the Black Hollow Highway 12 minutes out. and 25 years of buried truth was finally irreversibly in motion. Maya didn't cry when Ethan told her. That was the thing that undid him more than anything else that morning. He'd braced for tears for fear for the reasonable panic of a 12-year-old being told that her home wasn't safe and they needed to leave within the hour. He'd rehearsed a version of the explanation that was honest without being terrifying, that gave her enough truth to trust him without the full weight of everything he'd been carrying for 6 months. But Maya sat on the edge of the couch with her coat in her lap, and she listened to all of it, or the version of all of it he gave her, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Is the man outside nice?" Ethan blinked. "Victor, the one who came for the motorcycle, is he nice?" He thought about that carefully. "I think he's fair," he said. "I think he's the kind of man who's hard in ways that life made him hard, but I think he means what he says." Maya nodded slowly. "And he's going to make sure the bad people go to jail." "That's the plan." She looked at her hands in her lap. Then she looked up at him with those eyes that had always been older than they had any right to be. "Dad would have done the same thing you did," she said. "With the bike. He would have fixed it too." Ethan couldn't speak for a moment. "Yeah," he managed. "He would have." "Okay," Maya said. She stood up and started folding her coat with the practical efficiency of a child who has moved through difficult circumstances before and knows that the next step is always the same. You pack what matters and you go. "And how long do we have?" "An hour, maybe less." "Then stop standing there," she said simply. He packed in 35 minutes. There wasn't much to pack. That was the truth of the life they'd been living, that it all fit in 2 bags without difficulty. He took his father's tools, every single one wrapped in the cloth roll his father had kept them in. He took Maya's drawings. He took the notebook with 6 months of restoration notes. He left everything else. When he came out of the trailer for the last time, Sheriff Carla Tate's vehicle was in the yard. She was a woman in her late 40s, compact and precise, with the particular quality of someone who had spent a career in rooms where people underestimated her and had learned to use that as a professional tool. She was standing with Victor near the office, and between them was the oilskin pouch, and she was going through the documents with gloved hands and the careful focus of a person who has just been handed the missing piece of something they'd been building for years. She looked up when Ethan came out, studied him for a moment. "You're the mechanic," she said. "People keep saying that," Ethan said. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement of one. "I'm going to need a statement from you. Not now, in a few days when you're settled. Victor has my direct number." She looked back at the documents. "This is extraordinary. This is..." She stopped herself, recalibrated, put the professional distance back in place. "This is sufficient to issue warrants by end of day. For Reston and for Briggs, both." "Briggs is going to run," Victor said. "Not a prediction, a statement of expected behavior, the way you talk about a machine's likely response to a given input." "He's going to try," Tate said evenly. "He won't get far." She looked at Victor with the direct clarity of 2 people who have an understanding that lives outside normal channels. "I need them in custody, Victor. Legal custody. Whatever conversations are happening on your end need to stop before they go past information." Victor looked at her steadily. "Reston and his men are secured and untouched. You have my word." "I need more than your word. I need..." "You have my word," he repeated, quietly, finally. Tate held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and went back to the documents. Ethan watched the exchange and understood something that hadn't been clear before, that the relationship between Victor Maddox and Carla Tate was old and complicated and built on a foundation of mutual necessity and mutual suspicion that had somehow over time calcified into something closer to respect. She needed what he knew. He needed what she could do legally. They had found a way to coexist at that intersection without either of them fully trusting the other, and it worked because neither of them was naive enough to expect more than it was. 2 of Reston's men were already in the back of Tate's vehicle. The others were being processed by the 2 deputies she'd brought. Reston himself sat zip-tied on the running board of his SUV with his expensive coat and his assembled life and all his money, and he looked like a man watching a building he owned burn down from the inside. Grayson was sitting on the ground near the parts shed with Danny Rourke standing a careful distance away. Danny wasn't guarding him, he wasn't armed, wasn't positioned as security. He was just present in the way that witnesses are present because some things need to be seen by people who will remember them. Ethan carried his 2 bags to the area near the gate where Victor had indicated a vehicle would be waiting. A black pickup, older clean. A rider named Jimmy, who was the size of a refrigerator and had the gentlest eyes Ethan had seen on an adult male since his father. "I'll take you and your sister to the junction," Jimmy said. "From there we go south. 6-hour drive, give or take." Maya appeared at Ethan's elbow with her 1 bag. She looked at Jimmy with the frank, unfiltered assessment of a 12-year-old. "Are you a Hell's Angel?" she asked. Jimmy looked at her seriously. "I am." "Have you been in jail?" "Maya," Ethan said. "It's a fair question," Jimmy said, entirely unruffled. "Yes, twice, a long time ago." Maya considered this. "Are you good now?" Jimmy thought about it with genuine care. "I try to be," he said. Maya nodded as though this was the correct and honest answer, which it was. "Okay," she said. "I want the window seat." Jimmy looked at Ethan over her head with an expression that said clearly, and without words, "Your sister is going to be fine." Ethan felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was clenched. He was about to put his bags in the truck bed when Victor appeared beside him. "Walk with me for a minute," Victor said. They walked to the shed. Victor stopped in the doorway again, looking at the knucklehead. The engine had finally been shut off. Someone had done it while Ethan was packing, and the silence it left was the specific silence of a machine at rest, full and round rather than empty. "I want to tell you something about my brother," Victor said. He wasn't looking at Ethan, he was looking at the bike. "People remember Lucas as a legend, the Reaper, the Nomads president, the man who built this machine and hid the evidence and rode into an ambush knowing what it was." He paused. "What people forget is that before all of that, he was just a kid from a poor family in a nowhere town who was very good with his hands and refused to accept that the options in front of him were the only options available." He turned to look at Ethan. "Sound familiar?" Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. "He would have been 54 years old this year," Victor said. "He never got to be anything past 29. Something moved through his face, grief, but the old kind, the kind that has been lived with long enough to become part of the landscape rather than an emergency. When Cliff called me and told me someone had restored the bike that the engine was running, I didn't sleep for 2 days. I kept thinking it meant something, not superstition. He stopped. Just that some things are stubborn, some things refuse to stay dead. The truth stayed in that capsule for 25 years, Ethan said quietly. It did, because Lucas knew it would take that long to find the right person. Victor looked at the knucklehead one more time. Then he turned fully to face Ethan, and his voice shifted into the directness that Ethan had come to recognize as his most authentic register. "The bike stays here, in your shed. When you come back, and you will come back, I want it to be the first thing you see." Ethan blinked. "That's your brother's motorcycle." "My brother is dead," Victor said. "The motorcycle belongs to the man who brought it back." He said it with a finality that closed the subject. "Don't argue with me." Ethan looked at the knucklehead sitting quiet and complete in the shed, every piece restored, every detail intact. The engine tuned to a specific idle that a dead man's hands had dialed in 40 years ago and that Ethan had found by listening. He felt the full weight of 6 months settle over him and then lift. "Okay," he said. Victor put out his hand. Ethan shook it. It was a firm, sustained handshake, not performative, not brief, the kind that means something beyond social courtesy. Then Ethan picked up his bags and walked to the truck where Maya was already in the passenger seat with the window down, and Jimmy was ready, and Black Hollow was waking up around them to a morning it would spend the rest of the decade talking about. The first 3 weeks in Wyoming were the strangest of Ethan's life. The property was a working ranch outside Cody, functional, secure, staffed by people who asked no unnecessary questions and provided everything necessary without being asked. Maya had her own room for the first time in her life. The pulmonary function test happened on day 4, administered by a physician who came to the property rather than requiring them to go to a facility, and the results came back on day 6. Ethan was sitting at a kitchen table when the doctor handed him the report. He read it twice, then he looked up. "It's manageable," he said. Not a question, he was reading the conclusion, making sure his understanding matched the words. "Very manageable," the doctor said. "Early detection, appropriate treatment, normal life expectancy, no restrictions on activity." She's going to be fine. She paused. You caught this at exactly the right time. Ethan set the report down on the table very carefully. He sat there for a moment with his hands flat on the table and his eyes closed. Fine. She was going to be fine. He had been carrying the terror of the alternative for so long, the quiet, relentless terror of a parent-shaped fear in a 19-year-old's body, the dread of the thing the doctor had been careful not to say directly that its absence felt physical. Like setting down a weight he'd been so accustomed to that he'd forgotten what it felt like not to carry it. He called Victor that night from the phone Jimmy had given him. Her lungs are fine, he said when Victor answered. Manageable condition, treatable. She's going to be okay. Victor was quiet for a moment. Good, he said, and the single word contained more genuine feeling than most people put into paragraphs. Thank you, Ethan said, for the doctor, for all of it. Don't thank me, Victor said. Thank your father for teaching you how to listen to an engine. The legal machinery moved faster than Ethan had expected. Sheriff Tate had Gerald Reston in formal custody within 36 hours of leaving the scrapyard. Harold Briggs, the retired sheriff turned deputy mayor, was arrested at his home in Cascade County on day 2, attempting to access a safe deposit box that later turned out to contain additional documentation that corroborated the ledger entries precisely. 3 more men connected to the original conspiracy men, whose names appeared in the margins of Lucas Maddox's careful handwriting, were taken into custody over the following 10 days. The cassette tape was authenticated and its recording admitted as evidence. The DA's office described it in the formal language of legal proceedings as compelling and comprehensive. What they meant, as the local news reported, it was that Lucas Maddox had recorded 2 men explicitly discussing a murder-for-hire arrangement in his own voice, clearly without ambiguity, with dates and amounts and methods described in enough detail to eliminate any reasonable doubt about what was being discussed and by whom. He had known, Ethan realized. Lucas had known he wasn't coming back from Route 12. He had made the recording, sealed the evidence, hidden it in the machine he loved most, and ridden into the ambush anyway. Not because he was reckless, because he understood that the truth surviving him was worth more than him surviving the truth. That understanding settled into Ethan like something permanent. He went back to Black Hollow 6 weeks later. The town looked the same and felt completely different, the way a room feels different after the thing that was wrong with it has been removed and you can finally identify what the tension had been. Grayson's yard had been seized as part of the civil asset forfeiture proceeding connected to Reston's case. The property title was in legal dispute, which in practice meant it was sitting empty and administered by a county trustee. Ethan filed a claim on the property on his first day back, not for the yard itself, for the specific parcel that included the utility shed and the 20 feet of ground around it, the section that contained the knucklehead, and the few hundred square feet that could, with work, become something more than a cold shed. The trustee, a harassed county employee named Gerald Fitch, who was managing 17 disputed properties simultaneously, looked at the claim and then at Ethan and said, "You're 19. Yes, sir. You have money to support this claim." Ethan set the duffel bag on the desk. Gerald Fitch looked at the bag. He looked at Ethan. He processed something internally that didn't reach his face. "I'll file it today," he said. The claim was approved in 3 weeks. Danny Rourke showed up the day after approval with a truck and 2 of his nephews and spent an entire Saturday helping Ethan clear the section and assess the structure. Danny was 61 years old and worked like a man 20 years younger when he had a reason to, and he had been waiting. Ethan understood for 25 years for a reason that felt like something other than damage control. "You're staying?" Danny asked at the end of the day. "I'm staying," Ethan said. "Good," Danny said simply. And then after a pause, "Your father would have stayed too." It was the most Danny Rourke had ever said about Ethan's father directly, and it landed with the specific weight of a statement that had been held for a long time before being released. The garage took 8 months to build properly. Not because of lack of funds, the duffel bag had contained $250,000 in banded cash, which Ethan had counted 3 times because the first 2 times he'd been certain he was miscounting, and which he used with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that money spent wrong is worse than money not spent at all. It took 8 months because he built it right, because he sourced the right materials and hired the right people and refused to cut corners on anything structural, and because somewhere in the process of building it, he realized he was building something that needed to last beyond him. Walker Custom Cycles opened on a Tuesday in early spring with no ceremony and no announcement. By Thursday, there were 4 motorcycles in the shop. By the following Monday, there were 11. Word traveled the way word travels in the motorcycle world, not through advertising or social media or any deliberate broadcast, but through the specific channel of riders talking to riders, the oldest information network in American road culture. Someone had been in Black Hollow. Someone had seen the shed. Someone had met the kid. Someone had heard the story, and the story by that point had become something larger than Ethan himself. The first time a customer drove 400 miles to bring him a motorcycle, Ethan stood in the parking area of his new garage and looked at the man, a retired engineer from Seattle in his 60s, with a 1952 panhead that needed everything, and said, "You drove 400 miles." "I drove 400 miles, the man confirmed. He looked at the garage, at the sign at the shed visible behind it, where the knucklehead sat in a place of honor rather than a place of function. "Is that it? Is that the Reaper's bike?" "That's it," Ethan said. The man stood looking at it for a long moment with the expression people get when they're in the presence of something that has survived things it shouldn't have survived. "My father rode with the nomads in the early 70s, the man said quietly. He talked about Lucas Maddox until the day he died, said he was the best man he ever knew. He looked at Ethan. "Thank you for bringing it back." Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he said what his father would have said. "Come on inside. Let's look at what your panhead needs." The first anniversary of Lucas Maddox's death fell on a cold October Thursday. Ethan was in the garage at 7 in the morning when he heard them coming. He knew the sound now, the way you know the sound of something that has entered your life permanently. Not just a sound, but a vibration, a particular quality of approach that carries meaning before it carries words. He set down his tools. He walked to the garage door and opened it. They came from every direction. Not just from the highway this time, from the county road to the east, from the mountain pass to the north, from the southern route that came up through Wyoming. Victor had said hundreds. He had undersold it. Maya was at school. She was healthy. Her treatment was working, and her lungs were stronger than they'd been in 3 years. And she was doing well in the new school, in the next town over, where she'd made 2 friends who didn't know anything about Hell's Angels, or burned motorcycles, or the particular year her brother had gone to war with a scrapyard. Ethan stood in the doorway of his garage, his property, his foundation, and he watched them come. Victor arrived at the front of the column, same as before, riding with the same deliberate economy, the same unreadable face that had learned over decades to give almost nothing away. He pulled up and swung off and looked at the garage and at the sign and at everything that had been built in the space where a cold shed and a dead motorcycle had been a year ago. "The place looks good," he said. "Getting there," Ethan said. Victor looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced something small, a patch folded once the leather still stiff and new. He held it out. Ethan took it and unfolded it. It was not a membership patch. It was not a club identifier or a chapter rocker or anything that asked him to be something he wasn't. It was a single custom patch clearly made specifically and only for this purpose in the colors of the nomads, but belonging to no formal category within them. 4 words stitched in white on black. "Family ain't blood, it's loyalty." Ethan held it in both hands and read it twice and felt something move through him that was composed of equal parts grief and gratitude and a specific kind of joy that only exists on the far side of real loss, the kind that knows exactly what it costs to get here. He looked up at Victor. Lucas would have. "I know," Victor said quietly. "I know he would have." Behind them, hundreds of engines idled together under the October sky, and Danny Rourke was standing at the edge of the property with his hands in his pockets and something on his face that might have been the first uncomplicated piece he'd worn in 25 years. And Maya's winter coat was hanging on the hook inside the garage with a folded notebook page still in the lining that nobody had ever removed, and the knucklehead sat in his place of honor inside the shed, with its engine silent and its tank restored and its history finally completely irreversibly told. Ethan Walker put the patch in his breast pocket, the same pocket where he'd carried the dog tags, where he'd carried the oilskin, where he'd carried everything that mattered through the hardest year of his life. Then he looked out at the riders and the highway and the wide Montana sky, and he understood something that no amount of money or recognition or legitimacy could have given him on its own, That the boy who had crouched in a dead zone with a flashlight and a broken motorcycle and absolutely nothing left to lose had not been saved by luck or charity or the arrival of 240 motorcycles. He had been saved by the same thing that had saved Lucas Maddox's truth for 25 years. By refusing when everything said stop to stop. Some things are stubborn. Some things refuse to stay dead. And some people, the rare ones, the ones who listen when engines speak and stay, when everyone else leaves and choose right when wrong, would be so much easier. Some people earn something that cannot be bought or given or inherited. They earn it the only way it has ever been earned, one honest choice at a time.